Move your stuff or it's gone in 15 minutes. That was the ultimatum I was given on my own front porch. Imagine standing on the deck you built with your own hands, feeling diesel fumes sting your nose while bulldozer engines hum and neighbors brake hard to watch the spectacle. Like a scene from a disaster movie you never agreed to star in. My head felt hollow and hot at the same time, heart hammering a warning against my ribs. This wasn't clerical error or a misunderstanding. This was calculated. Bigger, uglier, intentional. If you'd been in my boots that morning, would you have walked away or stood your ground? Tuesday began exactly the way it should in the mountains. Quiet enough that you can hear your own breath. Cold enough to make coffee taste like survival. Bright enough to make pine needles glow like gold threads against the sky. I was sipping from a chipped mug on my deck when I heard heavy machinery dragging itself up the private road, echoing through the valley like a mechanical beast. Not the sound of a delivery truck or a contractor in a pickup. Not the sound of anything that belonged. My nearest neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, drives a Honda Civic with a muffler that announces her half a mile out. This was different. Heavy. Insistent. Wrong. I walked around the side of the house, mug still in hand, and the world shifted. 3 trucks, a flatbed hauling a bulldozer, and a crew in hard hats and reflective vests rolled into my clearing with the kind of practiced urgency that means they've done this before. The lead truck sported a logo that looked official enough at first glance, Regional Fire Safety Authority, but it didn't ring any bells. I know every agency with jurisdiction from this ridge to the state line. I'd never heard of that one. The foreman stepped out like he'd been rehearsing the role for years. Clipboard, safety vest, mustache with more swagger than sense. He didn't bother with small talk. "Sir, you need to evacuate the premises immediately," he said, voice flat and professional. "We have an emergency demolition order for this structure. Fire hazard assessment indicates immediate risk to surrounding forest areas." He held out a packet of documents that looked like they'd been created by people who'd seen real government paperwork but never touched it. Letterhead, signatures, seals. It was all there, but the typography was a hair off. The seal looked like it had been copied from a low-res image. The paperweight was wrong. Government documents have a feel to them, grainy, heavy, archival. This was office supply discount bin. I set my coffee on the railing and took my time. Regional Fire Safety Authority. I read. Interesting agency. Interesting because it doesn't exist. He stiffened. "Sir." And I'd know. I added, meeting his eyes and letting the pause do the work. "Because I'm the governor." Silence hit the clearing like a dropped anvil. A young laborer let his hard hat slip from his fingers. A few of the crew glanced at one another, eyebrows climbing like they wanted to retreat, without being the first to move. The foreman's mustache twitched. Credit to him. He tried to salvage it. "Regardless of who you claim to be," he said, clinging to his script, "we were contracted from out of state. We'll proceed under federal emergency protocols." "You don't have federal authority," I said, voice low and steady. "You're impersonating federal officials. That's a felony. Right now, I'm calling the county sheriff and the state police. Stand down." He whipped out his phone and dialed on muscle memory. A woman answered on the first ring. I couldn't make out her words, but I didn't need to. The tone said everything. Push through. Finish the job. Don't get rattled by an uppity homeowner. He hung up and gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You have 15 minutes to remove anything you want to keep," he said. "Then the structure comes down." That was the moment the fog burned off and the landscape sharpened. This wasn't random. Someone had chosen my house. The house built plank by plank after my mother's funeral. When I needed something solid to hammer grief into. The reading nook where she watched the sunrise on mornings when chemo didn't knock her flat. The kitchen where we made her last Christmas breakfast. Someone had decided to destroy the only place on earth that felt permanent. I pulled out my phone and hit record. "This is Governor Nick Hale," I said, panning across trucks, the bulldozer, and those phony documents. "I'm documenting a criminal conspiracy to demolish my private residence under fraudulent authority. The Regional Fire Safety Authority, cited here, does not exist. This crew is impersonating government officials to destroy private property." The foreman's face went pale. "Turn that off." "No." I said, walking backward toward my front door. I'm calling my security detail and state police. And since you're so eager to cite emergency protocols, we'll bring real law enforcement into this in a hurry. I dialed my state police liaison and made it clear. County sheriff, state police, immediately private residence, impersonation of government authority, threat to property. Meanwhile, the crew's nerves began to fray in visible ways. The cautious ones edged away from a bulldozer, hands drifting toward pockets, necks craning for exits that didn't look like prison. Others kept moving equipment. Following orders like muscle memory was all they had left. A puff of dust announced Mrs. Thompson before I saw her Civic crest a hill. She pulled in at an angle that would block any attempt at escape, hopped out, and started recording without missing a beat. "Nick, what in God's name is happening?" "Fraud, Mrs. Thompson," I said. "They showed up with fake federal paperwork to knock my house down. She's maybe 5'2" on a good day." But I watched her march straight to Foreman with the momentum of a courtroom prosecutor. "Young man, do you know whose property you're on?" she said, voice razor sharp. "You can't just show up and flatten someone's home with make-believe paperwork." He held out the same packet of junk. She skimmed, snorted. "Garbage. There's no such thing as a regional fire authority in this state. Fire authority is county or state. Period. Nobody's fooled by a home printer and a fancy seal. Mountains have a way of spreading news fast. One neighbor's urgent call travels the ridge like thunder. By the time the sirens came, 3 more cars had arrived. People stepped out with their phones high, forming a ring of watchful witnesses that any smart crew would treat like a tripwire. Deputy Miguel Martinez pulled up first, lights strobing the clearing into daytime. He's one of those officers who assesses a scene like he's counting cards. He took one look at the trucks, the bulldozer, the cresting panic, and called for backup. "Governor," he said, taking the paperwork. I handed him. "What am I looking at?" "Fake authority," I said, "impersonating federal officials to execute an illegal demolition." He flipped through the pages with experienced eyes. "Never heard of this outfit," he said, "and I'd know if it existed. Sir," he added to Foreman, "I'm going to need IDs for you and your entire crew, and I need to see real permits." The foreman's phone rang again. His face shifted 3 shades paler, and he ended the call fast. "Pack it up," he barked to his crew. But Deputy Martinez lifted a hand. "Not so fast. We need statements. We need to see every document you brought. This looks like a multi-jurisdictional investigation." By the time Sheriff Tom Williams arrived with additional deputies and the state police rolled into my driveway, the clearing felt less like a construction site and more like a crime scene. The crew began to fold the operation they had unfolded 30 minutes earlier. I stood on the porch, my hand resting on the railing I'd sanded myself, and realized how close this place had come to being nothing more than a pile of splinters. It wasn't lost on me that this wasn't about fire hazards. It wasn't about safety. This was about leverage, control, and spite. And one name rose through the noise like a bell. Valerie Pierce, HOA president, mid-50s. A smile with no warmth and a reputation for writing letters that could peel paint off a barn. She'd been hounding me for 2 years about violations that weren't violations under any statute that mattered. Threatening fines. Threatening emergency action if I didn't bring my place in compliance with rules I never agreed to. The kind of HOA harassment that turns neighbors into bruised fruit. Soft spots everywhere, always looking over your shoulder. The longer I stood on that porch, the more the puzzle resolved. Letters escalating from snippy to menacing. Emergency assessments no fire marshal had ever signed. Late fees calculated using math even the IRS would blush at. And now, demolition papers from a regional authority that didn't exist. Valerie had finally crossed from nasty HOA politics into felony territory. By dusk, the county had secured the trucks, collected statements, and impounded that bulldozer. I had more police business on my property than a crime drama, and rumors of an emergency HOA board meeting had zipped down the mountain faster than a winter sled. 7 that evening, the community center's parking lot looked like a fairground. Cars lined the road. People streamed toward the door with a kind of charged silence that only forms when everyone knows a reckoning is coming. Inside, the folding chairs weren't arranged for a cozy HOA chat. They were lined up facing a long table like a defendant's bench. Valerie sat in the middle, a navy blazer buttoned like armor. Her silver hair was scraped back into a bun that could hold a tent in a hurricane. She tapped a gavel like the sound alone could push her narrative forward. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she began, voice coated with syrup. "There's been some confusion about today's enforcement action. I'd like to clear that up." I stood up before she could pretend this was routine. "Let's skip the rebranding," I said. "You sent a demolition crew to my house with fake federal paperwork. I want to know why. And I want the names of everyone who helped." The room shifted like an animal getting ready to bolt. A murmur rolled through the rows. Some neighbors nodded at me. Others looked nervous, like they'd been on receiving end of Valerie's letters and wanted to avoid the same spotlight. "Governor Hale, you're out of order," Valerie shot back, gavel posed like a weapon. "This is an HOA meeting, not a courtroom." "You made it both," I said. "Who wrote those documents?" "Our legal counsel reviewed the paperwork," she said quickly, sliding the folder to her man at the end of the table. "Marcus Webb, local attorney, good at closings and by-the-book HOA tasks. Right now," he was sweating through his collar. "Marcus," I said, "did you review the documents authorizing the demolition of my house under an agency that doesn't exist?" He adjusted his glasses, throat bobbing. "Governor, I provided guidance based on information given to me by the HOA president. We believe we have proper authority for emergency abatement. For an agency that exists only on paper you printed," I said, "you believe what you were paid to believe." Phones were everywhere now, raised high, catching every word. Someone shouted, "Show us the law." A coffee cup tipped in the shuffle, brown liquid staining the neat stack of HOA notices. Valerie tried to keep talking. She tried to sound official, confident, in control. Every syllable felt thinner than the last. I pulled out my phone and held up a still frame captured from this morning's recording. "Here you are, Valerie, on the phone with the foreman. Your voice, giving explicit instructions to continue the demolition after you were told the authority was fake. Your exact words, 'Finish the job or you don't get paid.'" Silence dropped like snow. Board members turned to her in unison, as if someone had pulled a string. Neighbors looked at one another with a dawning realization that chilled the room. If this could happen to the governor, it could happen to any one of us. Valerie, Mr. Peterson, a longtime board member, asked, the word brittle with disbelief, "Please tell me you didn't authorize demolition under false authority." Valerie's face flushed the color of warning lights. Papers slid into her folder in a blur. The gavel clattered off the table and hit the floor like a verdict. I walked to front of the room and kept my voice calm. I've been governor for 3 years. I know every emergency agency with jurisdiction in this state. The Regional Fire Safety Authority never existed. Someone forged documents and hired a demolition team to destroy my home. The only person with motive and the audacity to make that happen is sitting right there. She straightened in her chair as if posture alone could defend her. "Your property has been in violation for 2 years, she said, volume rising. "This community has rules, and you think you're above them. We protect property values and safety. If emergency action is necessary, we take it." The room erupted. Not shouts, not chaos. A wave of voices, each with a story that sounded like mine, only smaller, and maybe worse because nobody had recorded it. A fence half a foot too tall, and a threat to tear it down at the owner's expense. A vegetable garden labeled non-compliant. A widow's mailbox that failed to meet standards with a removal deadline that felt like extortion. This wasn't one wrongdoing. It was a pattern. Mrs. Thompson stood up, fire in her eyes. "I've lived here 60 years. My husband served on this board 15 of them. Not once did we authorize demolitions. What you did today was criminal." Marcus tried to cut in, panic finally overtaking caution. "Valerie, we should discuss this privately. The legal implications are obvious," I said. Impersonating government officials, fraud, conspiracy to destroy property. If this pattern repeats across multiple properties, you're flirting with RICO charges. The word hung there, heavy as iron. The board had the goods since God gave geese. Peterson looked at his colleagues, swallowed, and spoke. According to our bylaws, any board member can call for an emergency vote of no confidence. He raised his hand. I'm calling one now. Valerie stood so fast her chair skittered. You can't. Yes, we can. Hands rose along the table. Even the ones who had aligned with her for years lifted theirs, like people recoiling from a flame. Effective immediately. You're removed as HOA president, Peterson said, voice quiet but steady. She gathered her papers with shaky hands, glaring at me on her way out. This isn't over, she said. Your property is still in violation. No, I said, dialing, but your freedom might be. By dawn, I got the call I'd been expecting. County Prosecutor Jennifer Collins sounded more alert than coffee could explain. Governor, based on the recordings and witness statements, we've secured warrants for Valerie Pierce and Marcus Webb. The fake documents are enough for impersonation charges. Their actions after the meeting add obstruction. Across town, Webb was on the back steps of his office, feeding paper into a barrel fire like it could outpace the sunrise. Neighbors watched from porches, filming, and the smell of burning paper moved down the block like a confession. When Sheriff Williams and I arrived at Valerie's house, it looked like a postcard for HOA perfection. Unimpeachable mailbox, freshly edged lawn, shutters aligned like soldiers. The sound from inside wasn't domestic. It was the grinding whine of a paper shredder in pain. The smell of melted plastic hinted at desperation. Ms. Pierce. The sheriff called, knocking with the authority of 30 years in uniform. We have a warrant for your arrest. Turn off the shredder and come to the door with your hands visible. The machine whined, then choked to silence. The deadbolt turned. Valerie opened the door in a bathrobe. Paper cuts like red lines mapped across her fingers. This is harassment, she said, chest heaving. I'm a private citizen. You're under arrest, Sheriff Williams said. Impersonating government officials. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Obstruction of justice. He read her rights while her face registered the reality that she'd moved herself in the HOA dais to the wrong side of a courtroom with 1,000 small steps. The ride to the jail was predictable. Denial, then self-justification, then denial again. Governor Hale has been violating standards, she started at one point. The recorder's on, Williams said, not unkindly. Keep talking. Webb had gone with the smarter option. He started cooperating before his cuffs were even cool. He admitted he'd helped draft documents he now claimed he believed were legitimate emergency abatement protocols. He admitted he'd trusted Valerie when she said there was a new federal authority working across states to crack down on fire hazards. He admitted he should have verified it, and he didn't. That should have been the end. A local scandal, a couple of felonies, a wake-up call for every HOA board in a 100-mile radius. But the thing about fakes is that real investigators can spot the tells. And when the feds started looking, they found red string leading out of our county and across state lines like a web. The FBI arrived with 2 agents who looked like they'd seen every version of white-collar crime under sun. Agent Daniel Reynolds ran point with a quiet focus that radiated competence. His partner, Agent Maya Patel, specialized in financial crimes and had an instinct for following money where it didn't want to be followed. They set up in a courthouse conference room and unpacked a case that exploded the story scope. Valerie wasn't just a petty tyrant in a mountain community. She built a consulting racket for boards that couldn't get compliance the legal way. For a fee, she would unlock emergency authority, fake agencies, fake seals, fake phone numbers, and create the illusion of federal power. She'd sold this illusion to HOAs in 4 states. She'd coordinated with demolition companies in 6. She'd laundered payments through shell accounts labeled consulting to hide kickbacks. What looked like a HOA dispute now looked like organized crime. Governor, Agent Reynolds said, opening a file that could have doorstopped a bank vault. This goes far beyond your property. We've tracked at least $2 million in fraudulent fees, forced modifications, and below-market sales linked to schemes coordinated by Ms. Pierce. Agent Patel slid bank summaries across the table. Payments were routed through multiple banks, sometimes out of the country. She layered transactions to obscure kickbacks and bribes. It's wire fraud. It's money laundering. And the victims, she paused, they're not random. The demographic charts made my stomach turn. High percentages of elderly homeowners, immigrant families, people less likely to challenge official documents, communities where English wasn't the primary language. Valerie had weaponized respect for government authority and fear of bureaucracy, aiming lasers at the most vulnerable. One story stood out like a jagged shard. David Martinez, a rancher in Texas. He'd received a water contamination emergency notice claiming his ranch was polluting groundwater. No proper inspection. No legitimate agency. Threats of prosecution if he didn't pay fines and remediation fees or sell. He sold below market to avoid ruin. He was 73 and didn't speak fluent English. Perfect target. Then the environmental evidence arrived, and the case widened again. EPA Inspector Dr. Patricia Williams unfurled aerial photos and water testing reports that transformed fraud into environmental crime. Illegal demolitions had contaminated watersheds with lead and asbestos. Wetland habitats had been bulldozed. Protected species had lost nesting grounds. In Nevada, a demolition site had polluted drinking water for hundreds of families. Cleanup costs pushed into 8 figures. Clean Water Act violations joined the list of federal charges. The state attorney general, Laura Wilson, stepped into the room with a team and a plan. She'd made a career of dismantling white-collar fraud that preyed on ordinary people. We're coordinating with federal prosecutors, she said, flipping through evidence with clinical calm. This fits RICO. We have civil rights violations. We have environmental crimes. We'll build a case that reflects the full harm. By then, my house had become a footnote, albeit a personal one. The avalanche was inevitable. The federal grand jury returned indictments that read like a ledger of wrongdoing. 43 counts against Pierce, 27 against Webb, conspiracy counts for contractors and 4 HOA presidents who climbed aboard the money train. At arraignment, Valerie's lawyer tried to spin straw into silk. My client acted in good faith under what she believed were legitimate protocols, he said. The judge didn't blink. The prosecutor, Ana Martinez, no relation to the deputy, laid out the smoking gun evidence. Trophy photos of demolitions that Valerie had taken herself. Spreadsheets from her laptop tracking profits and expansion plans. Recorded calls instructing crews to push forward even after they'd been warned they were using fabricated authority. Bail was denied. She was a flight risk and an ongoing danger. Webb saw the writing on the wall. He accepted a cooperation deal, surrendered his law license, and offered chapter and verse testimony against the operation he'd helped build. He brought boxes, emails, phone recordings, fake org charts of non-existent agencies, budget documents with fake seals. He admitted what he'd done, but he made sure the jury would know who'd masterminded it. Pre-trial, the defense filed motions that thudded to the floor one by one. Dismissed the RICO charges? Denied. Suppress financial records? Denied. Assert legitimacy of emergency authority that had never existed? Absolutely not. The court made it clear. This wasn't a paperwork misunderstanding. This was a criminal enterprise dressed up like public service. The trial felt like civic theater with life or death stakes. The gallery held a cross-section of America. Retirees, veterans, families from communities that had learned the hard way not to trust every official seal they saw. The prosecution's opening was straightforward and devastating. The defendant didn't just steal money, Martinez said. She created fake federal agencies and used them to terrorize citizens who believed they had no choice but to obey. Witness by witness, the case stacked higher than the mountains outside. Mr. Martinez, the rancher, described a letter that upended his life and the pressure that forced him to sell. Mrs. Santos told the court how fake immigration enforcement had been used to squeeze her for every saved dollar, paying for modifications she didn't need under threat of deportation fears. Mrs. Jensen, an 82-year-old widow from Colorado, described watching the only home she had left be torn down by men who claimed to be working under emergency orders. They said if I didn't comply, I'd face federal charges, she said, voice steady with the kind of strength that makes jurors swallow hard. I was alone. What could I do? The environmental testimony was clinical and brutal. Dr. Williams laid out contaminated waters, destroyed habitats, and long-term damage. The numbers were bleak. The photos were worse. This wasn't just HOA fraud. It was a public health crisis that would haunt communities for decades. Financial analyst Robert Chong untangled the cash flow like a magician, unraveling knot after knot. She used multiple accounts across 6 states, he said, laundered proceeds from fraudulent consulting fees, coordinated kickbacks, total fraudulent transactions, $3.7 million and counting. Webb took the stand and sealed the case. He admitted his role, but he showed how Valerie had orchestrated everything, down to scripted pitches for HOA boards, slide decks that sold emergency authority consulting, and timelines for expanding into 20 more communities within a year. She hadn't just committed a run of crimes. She'd built a business model. The defense tried to argue good faith. They tried to claim miscommunication. They tried to repaint the trophy photos as documentation. The jurors looked unconvinced long before deliberation. It took them 3 hours to deliver guilty on all counts. Sentencing felt less like a finish line and more like a line that would ripple outward for years. The victim's statements shook the room. Mrs. Jensen explained what it meant to lose the cabin she and her late husband built after Vietnam. Mr. Martinez described the hollow feeling of mistrusting every piece of mail with a government seal. Mrs. Santos talked about a 12-year-old who still asked if the government people would come back. Prosecutor Martinez laid out the numbers. $14.7 million in damages between victim losses, environmental cleanup, medical costs, and monitoring. Investigators had chased down Pierce's hidden assets, offshore accounts, investment properties, cash disguised as consulting revenue. It wouldn't be enough to make everyone whole, but it would fund restitution and environmental remediation. Judge Morrison didn't need theatrics. Ms. Pierce, he said, you created and led a criminal enterprise that crossed state lines, targeted the elderly, immigrants, and disabled veterans, and contaminated protected environments. This was not enforcement. This was exploitation. He sentenced her 12 years in federal prison on racketeering and civil rights violations, ordered $12 million in restitution, and imposed a lifetime ban from any role in HOA or community enforcement work. Webb received probation with strict conditions, permanent disbarment, and a restitution order that would dog his bank accounts for life. The legal system didn't stop at individual justice. Lawmakers moved fast. The Federal HOA Accountability Act passed with bipartisan support, establishing real penalties for impersonating government officials in community enforcement and tightening oversight on HOAs nationwide. Our state passed companion laws, mandatory reporting for suspicious enforcement, a hotline managed by the Attorney General for HOA fraud, and free legal assistance for elderly and disabled homeowners facing aggressive tactics. Consumer protection and homeowner rights stepped out of the abstract and into the daily lives of people who needed those protections the most. Meanwhile, cleanup began. The cabin site in Colorado was restored and set aside as protected land with a memorial garden. The contaminated Nevada watershed received a long-term monitoring system and remediation we all hope would eventually bring clean water back to families who've been unknowingly put at risk. Criminals treat homes like targets on a spreadsheet. Communities don't have that luxury. We rebuild. We restore. We remember. Neighborhood trust takes longer to repair than an aquifer. Local law enforcement launched liaison programs so elderly and minority residents could verify any official notices and get help navigating them. Immigration advocacy groups partner with federal agencies to rebuild confidence that legitimate authority exists to protect, not prey. The memorial garden at our community center became a place where stories overlapped. Stones from Mr. Martinez's ranch laid into a walkway, a mountain pine planted by Mrs. Jensen's daughter, benches inscribed with names, the phrase, in memory of homes lost, justice found, and futures protected. Some mornings, Mrs. Thompson still stops by for coffee. We sit in the kitchen my mother loved, and she asks what I ask myself more often than I'd like to admit. How many other communities are dealing with something like this and don't know it yet? The truth? Too many. The investigation that started on my porch became a template for other districts. More victims came forward. More boards were investigated. More demolition companies learned that just following orders isn't a fence when those orders come from forged authority. The FBI built a task force to monitor HOA fraud and related schemes. The Civil Rights Division published guidance on identifying systematic discrimination disguised as compliance. The EPA issued bulletins to local agencies about red flags for illegal demolitions. The words HOA fraud, impersonating government officials, environmental crimes, and civil rights violations moved from the fine print to the headlines. Law schools began studying the case. Bar associations turned it into continuing education for attorneys too casual about emergency paperwork. International partners noticed the offshore accounts and strengthened cooperation to track money laundering tied to systematic fraud. Canada and Mexico tightened their own rules around HOA enforcement and community authority claims. The ripple kept moving. 2 years after sentencing, I received a letter from Mrs. Jensen's granddaughter. She was studying law, planning to specialize in elder abuse prevention. She thanked me for standing my ground, but said something I think about when the sun hits a mountain just right and everything looks golden and brand new. You didn't just protect our family, she wrote. You showed us how to protect others. The final irony of the whole ordeal is that the woman who set out to protect property values by terrorizing her neighbors actually created the kind of community she insisted she wanted. Only it formed in defiance of her. Neighbors became friends while facing a common threat. Families who'd never shared a word offered rides, food, testimony. The fight against HOA harassment and fake federal authority united people who might never have found one another otherwise. Now, when I stand at the reading nook and watch morning light spill across the valley, I see more than mountains. I see all the people who refuse to be intimidated. Mrs. Thompson blocking a truck with a Civic, a deputy who recognized real authority from counterfeit, a sheriff who took time to read rights and record facts, agents and attorneys who pulled a thread until a criminal enterprise unraveled, victims who stood in court and told the truth when it would have been easier to go home and be quiet. And I see the question I asked myself when a man with a mustache and a clipboard told me I had 15 minutes to pack my life into boxes. Walk away or stand your ground. If you've been through something like this, HOA harassment, illegal demolition threats, fake federal notices, tell your story. Share it with neighbors, community groups, and law enforcement. Let people know what red flags look like. If this hit you the way it hit me, drop a comment. Your experience might be the warning someone else needs. As for me, I learned a few things the hard way. Property rights aren't just about deeds and lines on a map. They're about dignity. Homeowner rights aren't theoretical. They're the difference between sleeping well and sleeping with your boots on. And when authority is used as a weapon, it's not just a crime against a person. It's a crime against the trust that keeps a community together. We saw what happens when people in reflective vests show up with forged letterhead and a bulldozer. We also saw what happens when a community closes ranks and says no. That's how fraud ends. That's how consumer protection becomes more than a phrase. That's how a mountain town reminds everyone watching what accountability looks like. So if you ever hear diesel in your driveway and someone tells you you've got 15 minutes, breathe. Ask for their authority. Call the sheriff. Call your neighbors. Hit record. And remember, the loudest person on your porch isn't always the one with the law on their side. Thanks for sticking with me. If this story gave you something worth keeping, if it made you a little more stubborn about what's yours, a little more cautious about official paperwork, a little more determined to stand up for vulnerable folks, let me know. Share it with someone who needs it. We're building something here that matters. A community that knows the difference between real authority and a scam with a seal and has the backbone to stand its ground.